I'm Anessa, and I work as an adult services librarian at the Ames Public Library. And this is Clelia.
I also work as an adult services librarian.
We're here to give you some recommendations for our second annual 12 to Try reading challenge. For the month of January, the challenge is an award-winning book from the last decade. Stay tuned for our suggestions or come to the library and check out our display promoting the challenge. Clelia, what's your first recommendation?
So I chose two books from kind of either end of the decade. So this is Fortune Smiles by Adam Johnson. It was the 2015 National Book Award winner and Story Prize winner. It's a book of short stories. They're pretty long. I think there are 6 short stories in this one collection. Each of them is really detailed and crafted to feel like its own world. I would read a whole novel's worth of each of them, especially the first one called Nirvana. He builds like a whole near-future dystopian world with character backstories and relationships in this first story, and then it's a shock when it ends and it's not a novel. The stories take their time, and the language is straightforward with no unneeded flourishes, but the writing is amazing. I read this the year it came out, and then I just reread it in March on a trip. So it was really great for like waiting in the airport and reading here and there. Another story that's great is it's called George Orwell Was a Friend of Mine. It's from the perspective of an ex-Stasi officer who fails to reckon with the public memory of atrocities he was complicit in. You know, like he walks his little dog around the complex and like mocks the tourists, and it's dark but really interesting perspective. I feel like Johnson is really good at getting inside the heads of protagonists, especially people you wouldn't think you could understand or empathize with, and then you gain a lot from like reading from their point of view. He also likes to write about people involved in tragedies beyond their control, like fatal illness or addiction, natural disasters, and the stories are really about ways that people keep going and find meaning. This will sound hyperbolic, but it's the kind of book that makes you feel glad to be alive. I really love this book. I would read it a third time. I'd recommend it for anyone who likes Ling Ma's short stories, or Black Mirror, the show. I think you'd like this too. Yeah, they're some of the best I've ever read.
That sounds really cool. So my first recommendation was the Edgar Award winner in 2021. It's Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line by Deepa Anappara. It tells the story of a plucky 10-year-old boy named Jai who's growing up in an Indian slum and goes in search of children who have gone missing. Jai's bright, precocious voice really brings levity to the novel. But this is definitely not a happy, cheery children's book or a cozy mystery. Jai is facing some really terrible, dangerous situations, and he has to learn that, unlike in his beloved detective shows, not all injustices are easily resolved in 45 minutes plus advertisements. Anappara was a journalist in India, so she's writing about the real problems and situations that she saw as a journalist every day in India. It's a very intense, very powerful, emotional work, and I'd really recommend it for people who liked Emma Donoghue or Amor Towles. So it's really a very, very good mystery book. But I'd also recommend it for people who like more literary fiction, because it does kind of have that vibe as well. Really, really excellent. Definitely deserved that Edgar Award. Mm-hmm. All right, Clelia, what's your next book?
Okay, my other book, it's a memoir. It's called How to Say Babylon by Safiya Sinclair. This was the 2023 National Book Critics Circle Award winner. It was also a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. It's a lyrical, interesting memoir about the author's upbringing in a restrictive, patriarchal Rastafarian household in Jamaica. She endures physical and emotional abuse and lives in a world where her father is God, basically, and a woman's greatest virtue is obedience and silence. Babylon is her father's word for the wider world that he feels like he's up against, or like Western culture in general. Safiya takes us through her conflicted feelings and growing understanding and clarity about her family and just like the environment she's growing up in. She writes with a lot of empathy for her mother, who uses marijuana to cope with daily life and not allow herself to feel the reality of what's happening. She writes really beautifully about her seaside childhood and experiences with nature, relationships that shaped her. She's also a poet. She was a published poet first before she wrote this memoir, so the language is really beautiful. She escapes mentally through education and the power of words, and writes about poetry becoming a lifeline that really led her out of her circumstances. I did not know anything about Rastafarianism or Jamaican history before I read this, and I feel like I learned a lot, and she really puts her story in a wider colonial and cultural context, but it's still very much her own and a unique story of how she made it out of this environment. I couldn't stop talking about this when I was reading it. I was recommending it to people, so.
She really was.
Yep, it's so good. I would also recommend it for anyone who read Educated by Tara Westover. It's a similar story, and it's also written like so well you can't put it down. So, highly recommend.
Thanks, Clelia. Interestingly enough, my recommendation is also about women escaping abusive, oppressive circumstances. But this one is a fantasy novel. It is a fairy tale, actually. It won the Hugo Award in 2023, and it's not hard to see why. Interestingly enough, though, did you know that the Hugo Award is one of the only major awards that's voted on by popular demand?
Oh,
Yeah. So everybody who attends the World Science Fiction Convention every year gets to vote on the Hugo Awards. And in 2023, this is the one that was the most popular. It is both a love letter to and an inversion of classic fairy tales. It features women fighting back against abuse and oppressive power structures. And there's also a whole lot of magic and fairies and all sorts of amazing things. It's really, really cool, the world building. But it's also like really funny too, in kind of a weird way. It tells the story of Mara, who's the youngest of 3 princesses, and she sets out to rescue her sister from the abusive prince that the sister was forced to marry. So it's definitely kind of like a rescue the princess situation, but in this case, the prince is the bad guy, and it's her sister trying to rescue her. So she has accomplished like 3 impossible tasks and is gathering together like a ragtag band of unlikely heroes. It's really cool. And because it really juxtaposes like the grim and the witty and the just plain absurd. It's fantastic. It does contain some dark elements, but it's way too funny to be a drag. Also, side note, you definitely don't have to worry about the dog dying in the book. The dog is already dead and has been since reanimated. So definitely not something to worry about there. I'd recommend it for fans of Gregory Maguire or Marissa Meyer. So yes, Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher.
I need to check that one out.
All right, those are our recommendations for January. Award winners in the last decade. If you want some more recommendations, come see us at the library or check out our display.